And welcome to Lansdowne and to another new series these Sunday evenings from the book of Daniel. We've got another new caption, new logo, new image. We're very grateful, by the way, to Laura Wood and other members of our creative and media team. Laura, I think, came up with the design for that, and we really appreciate the work that goes in every week to making parts of our church life possible. Very helpful as well to hear from Gareth just now about culture. And I guess that's where I'm starting tonight. Interestingly, people with Christian faith today are finding that the culture of Britain appears, hostile to us. There have been a number of recent high-profile cases which have led to prosecutions against Christians through the courts, like the Christian owners of that Cornish bed and breakfast, whose room policy was regarded as discriminatory. The British Airways stewardess who successfully overturned her dismissal for wearing a cross chain at work by an appeal to the European Court of Human Rights. Right now, a Christian GP in Margate is under investigation by the GMC, the General Medical Council, following a complaint that he shared his faith with a patient. A van driver in Wakefield has been asked to remove his cross palm from the dashboard of his housing association van. A couple in Derby have had their application to foster a child turned down because of their Christian sexual ethics. Now, that's just a few of the many who are finding that they are being made to feel like unwanted strangers in their own land. Exiles among the very streets they live and places where they work. I don't know, but you may well be experiencing something of the same disorientation. Not as dramatically, probably. You're not about to be imprisoned or executed like believers in parts of India or the Middle East and Africa, but nonetheless, you feel got at, out of place somehow. Uncomfortable in your own country. Those Christian beliefs and values which you hold are, we know, quietly laughed at in the places of our work. We're conscious, possibly, of being in that small, shrinking minority. Possibly, tonight, I'm speaking to someone who's the only follower of Jesus in their family. And then think about our students and young people. To make a stand for Jesus on campus or in the school classroom, when you might well be the solitary Christian on your course or in your accommodation block, hey, that takes considerable courage and bottle. You see, something has happened in our culture during the last 50 years. The Christian consensus, the Christian framework, if you like, of the UK has virtually broken down in the last 50, 60, 70 years. And one of the reasons is this: when you have mosques and temples and churches in the same street, why should Christians and Christianity have special status? In our age, tolerance has become the great idol. In a multicultural society, tolerance, everyone says, is the way forward. But you see, as far as the Christian is concerned, it's a strange kind of tolerance. For it looks as if the only thing which cannot be tolerated by society is a group of people who say they believe in a God who makes exclusive truth claims. Off with their faith heads, shouts the aggressive secularist, while most politely dismiss us and give us a very wide berth. So then, how are we going to cope in such a changed world? Well, we have several options. On the one hand, we can live in the past. We can nostalgically remember what it was like when most people had respect of some kind for Christianity, and people knew the authors of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's option one. We can become romantic and nostalgic. Option two, we can live in isolation We can disengage from society and culture. We can withdraw even further into the margins, living in our holy huddles for warmth and security. We can run from Christian meeting to Christian meeting and hope that none of the neighbors or work colleagues ask us what we did on a Sunday. Or thirdly, third option, we can dare to be like the remarkable man whose life and book we're going to investigate on Sunday evenings. We can dare to be a Daniel. For Daniel illustrates that it is possible to live a life of faith which is fully engaged in the most hostile of cultures and hold on to our convictions. Daniel shows us how we can be faithful to God and make a significant impact in society. How we can be, in the words of Jesus, in the world, but not of the world. You see, as we were thinking this morning in our new series in 1 Peter, we may just be passing through. But Daniel tells us we can accomplish an awful lot along the way. I sometimes follow Nicky Gumbel's tweets, and this week, one tweet particularly helpful in terms of our theme tonight. Here's Nicky Gumbel. In every generation, the world is changed by a few people who stand for something, who do not fear unpopularity, and who dare to make a difference. I think Nicky Gumbel was writing my message for me. Daniel was one of those people. One of those few people who stood for something, who didn't fear unpopularity, and made a difference. Now, Daniel, he lived 26 centuries ago. That's a long time ago. And he wrote what he did towards the end of a very long career as one of the top civil servants during the reigns of three of the most powerful men in the ancient world, Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, the Babylonian emperors, and Darius, the Medo-Persian king. So you see, Daniel knows a thing or two about politics and the exercise of power. And his journal, that Gareth read the first chapter from, is a deliberate reflection on how he handled those pressures, the pressures of public office. He's got lots to teach us, as Daniel, about how we can reach the top without losing our way in the process. How we can live a life connected to the culture, yet without compromise. How we can stand up under the pressure to cave in. How we can maintain our distinctive identity. I really don't think Daniel would agree with those who say a Christian cannot be involved in business or in the performing arts or media or in top-level sports. No, I think he'd argue for the very opposite. But Daniel has something else to teach us, which is perhaps even more important than that. It's the explanation as to how he maintained his identity. How, although on his way to the top, he didn't lose it in the process. He did it, and here's my first major point, he did it by making sense of the story of his life, the story of our lives. That's the truth, I think, behind verses 1 and 2. It lies there in the opening paragraph. Daniel makes sense of the story of his life in Babylon and the world he lives in. Now, just look at this on the screen. This is called the Babylon Chronicle, number 5. You can find examples of this, if you realize it, in the British Museum. You wouldn't recognize the writing. It's cuneiform. It's the Akkadian language, one of the Semitic languages, in which the Neo-Babylonian Empire grew up. So this is a bit of history written by the Babylonian chronicler. And actually, I don't read cuneiform. It actually says, he, Nebuchadnezzar, encamped against the city of Judah, and on the second day of Adar, he seized the city and seized the king. He appointed a king of his own pleasure over the city. He took tribute and conveyed it to Babylon. That's a secular Babylonian chronicler. And you can see examples of other Babylonian chronicles, as I say, in the British Museum. Now, listen to the beginning of the Jewish chronicle. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Do you see what's going on there? You see how Daniel, towards the end of his career, reflects on the story of his life, and he makes sense of it at 2 levels. He makes sense of it at the personal level, but also at the global level. Think about the trauma of exile for the nation of Judah. It was very real, and for Daniel in particular. He was a young man, probably in his teens at the time that the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar took place. It would have been terrifying. All that was familiar to Daniel, the young teenager, all that was secure for him was ripped away. The Babylonian policy of shock and awe was working. The temple was razed to the ground in Jerusalem, and its contents were ransacked. Jerusalem was the only city where its temple in the ancient world, you could not find an image of God. The temple in Jerusalem was the only temple in the ancient world where you could not find an image of God, because the God of the Jews was believed to be unique, the absolute, transcendent, all-powerful creator. Now that worldview was in contrast to the idolatry of all the temples of the ancient world, and there were 1,000 temples in the city of Babylon alone. Each of these temples with their images deifying parts of creation. Now you see the problem. How then could Israel's all-powerful God suffer defeat at the hands of this idol-worshipping king from Babylon? Why did Daniel's God not do something? Why did he allow his people to be conquered and the temple in which he was worshipped to be ruined? That was the intellectual challenge to Daniel's faith. Now, what may seem to us as we read verse 2 a very small detail, as Daniel mentions how Nebuchadnezzar took some of the articles or the sacred vessels from the temple in Jerusalem back to Babylon, what may appear to us to be insignificant is in fact very important. For those vessels in the temple of Jerusalem would have been symbols of the holiness of God. Those articles would have been set apart for special use in the service of the God of the Jews. And here they were, now on display in the emperor's museum for captured gods. Where is your God now, Daniel? He's just another powerless deity in Nebuchadnezzar's trophy cabinet. How could the captivity and exile of the nation possibly make sense? You see the question, is there a God behind history, or is it really all a lottery? And Daniel's response to the story of his own life and the story of the nation is in the phrase which begins the second verse. Did you pick this up? Listen, verse 2. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. The Lord did it. This wasn't an accident, in other words. God wasn't wrong-footed by the Babylonian invasion. In fact, ultimately, Daniel realized that God was behind it. And that was how Daniel made sense of the big story of world history and of his own life. The Lord God is sovereignly in charge of the affairs of nations. Presidents come and go because God says so. Civilizations rise and fall at God's command. History has a purpose and a gatekeeper. Daniel really believed that. For God was not only behind it, He had predicted and promised the exile. Daniel's conviction about that was shaped by his reading and understanding of God's character and God's word. We haven't got time to dig into chapter 9 tonight, but in chapter 9, we find Daniel there praying about the exile and interpreting it in the light of what God had already said about the exile through Jeremiah the prophet. Listen to these words from chapter 9 and verse 2. In the first year of his reign, the reign of Darius, I, Daniel, understood from the scriptures, according to the word of the Lord given to Jeremiah the prophet, that the desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years. So this 70-year captivity was part of God's refining purpose for his people. This was his judgment. But the end game was their salvation. For Daniel was a dealer in hope, the hope of God's kingdom as he would deliver on his promises. That was the big storyline. And looking back all these years later, Daniel knew that God was behind both the global history of the nations and his own personal pain. Not just behind that, but in it. God was in the devastation, in the disruption and loss of everything that he loved and made him feel secure. Daniel saw that God's will can be done in exile. For in the trauma is a truth, danger, God at work. It's always so. And Daniel underlines that twice more in our chapter 1, at verse 9. Notice what he says. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy. And again in verse 17, to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. In the horror of exile, God was in the details of the lives of these 4 young men. And that detail involved them becoming fully immersed in the culture of Babylon. Among the greatest temptations for Christians and the Christian church in the West today, as it was for men of faith like Daniel, among the greatest temptations is to withdraw, to retreat, to put up the barricades and to wait. But Daniel didn't withdraw. He got stuck in. Neither did Joseph or Moses before him, and neither must we. We must enter the culture, take it on, influence it, and not be influenced by it. And that brings me to the second major lesson of chapter 1. One of the most effective ways of making sense of the story of what God is doing is by maintaining our identity. This Babylonian policy of assimilating all the bright, gifted people into the culture was a brilliant political move. You see what they did? They took the best young minds of the generation, the opinion formers and the leaders, the movers and the shakers, and for 3 years, they gave them all that this advanced Babylonian culture had to offer. It's not difficult to see what they were trying to do. They hoped that this would sever the roots of those they had taken captive from their past, if not erase their identity. Of course, that's the way that many regimes work in the world today. So, in our storyline, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his friends, attend King's College, the best university in Babylon. They learn new subjects like science and mathematics and astronomy. They learn new languages and they read new books. And they are even given new names. Daniel becomes Belteshazzar, Hananiah, Shadrach, Mishael, Meshach, and Azariah, Abednego. New books, new names, new ideas. And if the best degree course in the world, taught by the best professors in the world, wasn't irresistible enough, then every day these bright young things were wined and dined with food and drink from the king's own kitchens. And yet, it was the issue of the restaurant menu that Daniel chose to use as his line drawing point. You see, verse 8 says, "But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way." Now, I'll come back to the broader application in a moment, but register the principle. If we want to maintain our identity in a hostile culture, in exile, then we have to draw the line somewhere. It seems rather odd here to me where Daniel drew his line. You see, the food menu. He didn't boycott the lectures. He didn't start up a student protest movement. He didn't organize a petition. No, he got fully involved in all that the faculty of Babylon was offering him. He fed his mind with the ideas and worldviews of Babylon. But when it came to the issue of food from the king's table, he said no. Daniel made what was in many ways a very private stand. He went in verse 12, he went vegan, didn't he? "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So the court official, Ashpenaz, agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. Vegetable-only diet and water. Was this therefore a Jewish food law that Daniel wanted to observe? The interesting thing is that he refuses not just the meat from the king's table, he refuses the wine as well. Now, alcohol was not prohibited in the law of Moses. Whatever the reason for Daniel, it represented an issue for him of religious conscience. He believed it to be in some way an issue of defilement. Notice the phrase, "But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine." Was this therefore food offered to one of the hundreds of idols in Babylon's many temples? Yet, if so, weren't the vegetables that Daniel ate also defiled as part of the food offerings in these pagan temples? We can't be sure. Whatever, for 10 days, Daniel and his mates tucked in to lentils and broccoli, to bean shoots and carrots. Perhaps what was going on here was that Daniel regarded enjoying food and drink from the king's table as a kind of step too far. We know from Near Eastern culture that eating with someone in the ancient world was a sign of friendship and loyalty. Maybe then it was the suggestion that Daniel wanted to avoid, that he was a friend. It was this meal too far, perhaps. Who knows? We can't be sure. And of course, it was perfectly possible for Daniel to enjoy good food and wine and remain devoted to God. This seems to have been a personal line in the sand that Daniel drew. Although such was his influence that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego joined him in this unusual diet. Daniel, says the writer, resolved not to defile himself. Literally, he purposed in his heart. He wrestled with how he could maintain his identity, and this was where he felt he had to win a battle. Maybe this was Daniel's way of saying to himself and to his political masters, "You can take away my home, you can take away my family, you can even take away my name, but you cannot capture my heart for that belongs to God. It was then very much a private victory of faith which Daniel seems to need to win. You see, he knew his own heart. The university and the courts of Babylon must have been an intellectually intoxicating environment for a young man like him to grow up in. Perhaps then the king's food and drink came to represent for Daniel a temptation to swallow everything that he was learning. The fascination with the occult and magic for which Babylon was famous, along with its idols. Maybe he was very aware of the seductive lure of political power, which was the carrot that all this training dangled in front of him. Maybe Daniel knew that he was not invulnerable to the worldviews of his highly educated lecturers. Worldliness is what we often call it, and it comes in all shapes and sizes. But it invariably appeals to our desire for advantages, prizes, privileges. And maybe Daniel knew his own heart, how easily he could be seduced by these things. Sometimes the real enemy of our faith is not persecution, but pleasure. We become so captured by the pleasures of life that we lose our edge, our cutting edge. The point is, we will all draw our lines differently. But if we want to retain our Christian distinctiveness, then we'll have to draw them somewhere. We each have to know where our Achilles' heel is, our spiritual weak point, for we will all have them. Therefore, what may be perfectly okay for someone else may be the very thing which trips you up. There are certain foods and wines that we need to avoid, which perhaps don't apply to others. There are certain internet sites which we know might take us in the wrong direction. There are certain places we are better to avoid. There are certain friendships we would be foolish to cultivate. Certain activities and hobbies which can get such a hold of us that if we're not careful, we can spend all our time and effort and money on them. It's been said that the human heart is an idol-making factory. And we need to guard our hearts. That's what Daniel was doing. The heart is the place in the human life where the internal motivators and drivers for our action are derived. And it's those drivers, those motivators that can erode our sense of who we are and who we ultimately serve and follow. Our identity as men and women of faith is not in the end safeguarded by externals. That is very much the way religion works. It insists on the performance of certain external rituals, the keeping of physical outward boundary markers. But Christian identity is not the result in the end of wearing a cross. No. Christian identity in the end is the result of confessing Jesus is Lord. By setting Jesus Christ apart by faith in our hearts. That's what the New Testament says. Now, of course, that will have practical implications for each of us. And we each have to work out those implications in the context of our lives and our circumstances. No two of us are the same. We will draw the lines differently. And that also means that there will be things we do as well as things we don't do to maintain our distinctiveness. And I guess doing what we've done just now in eating and drinking communion together is one of those ways in which we maintain our distinctive identity. We tell each other what really matters. We reinforce the confession, Jesus Christ is Lord. What it does not mean is that we opt out of society altogether. That was not on Daniel's agenda. He did not refuse to go to college. He did not say no to education and learning, even at the Hogwarts of his day. He got stuck in, and yet he maintained his identity. He embraced as much as he could of the culture without compromising his convictions. Maybe that was because he knew where to draw the line precisely in the right place for him. The place where he knew his heart was going to be especially weak if he did not defend it there. Of course, at the end of the 10-day trial period, Ashpenaz, Nebuchadnezzar's chief of staff, saw the evidence for himself. Verse 15 tells us, at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine, and they were to drink, and gave them vegetables instead. And according to verse 18, as the degree course came to an end, and all the graduates were presented to the king, listen to this in verse 19, the king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. Now, the life lesson of this chapter is not that if you eat all your vegetables, you'll grow up to have bigger brains and get a first-class honors. That is not the lesson of this chapter. Here's the lesson, and with this I close. If you want to maintain your identity as a believer in an environment that is hostile to your faith, then you need to watch out for the king's food. Whatever that is for you, because the king's food can ruin your spiritual appetite. Of course, if you know what happens next in this amazing book of Daniel, then you will know that Daniel and his friends have much bigger battles to fight and to win. And this time not in the privacy of their own hearts, but on a very public stage. They have giant state-inspired images to resist bowing down to. They have fiery furnaces to face and escape from. They have lions' dens to enter and survive. And I wonder if the secret of their public triumph then, in the upcoming chapters, was the private victories they won here in chapter 1, in the University of Babylon, as younger men. So let me say to all of us, but especially to our young friends tonight, if you don't win the small battles when you're young, you'll never ever win the big ones. And we will never take a stand in public for Jesus unless we are prepared to take a stand in private. Faith can be, must be lived out on the front line, not behind the closed doors of the church. We are called as believers in Jesus to enter the culture, and as we do so, not be compromised by it. And that means that you have in the quietness of your own heart to set apart Jesus as Lord and win those private battles. For if you win the private battles, you're likely to have the bottle to deal with the public issues you'll have to face. And if you, by the grace of God, can learn to win those small battles, then God will give you the courage and determination to face the bigger ones in the years ahead. And as we do so, so like Daniel, so like all men and women of faith, we know that God is with us. That God is the God of our own personal story, involved in the details of our lives. And as we trust him, by his Holy Spirit and through his truth, he will enable us to stand strong, to be those men and women who, in any generation, can dare to make a difference. That's the theme of the song we're going to finish with tonight. It picks up this idea that God's people have God as their shepherd. And that as they live their lives, as they get involved in society and culture and make their decisions, they trust in him. And that by God's grace, that journey of trusting God will bring about in them growth and development all their days until the Good Shepherd calls them home. So let's stand to sing, "The Lord's my shepherd, and I will trust in him."